In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to protect your assets in case of a divorce. And we're going to talk to before you get married and after you get married. And I want to start this video by saying the disclaimer that this is even if you truly love and trust the other person. We don't set up a prenuptial agreement hoping to get divorced. Just like with insurance, we don't buy insurance hoping to get in an accident, but we're so happy it's there when it does. And the reality is, if you don't set up a prenuptial agreement, the state has a default agreement for you, and it may be something that you don't like that isn't aligned with your values. For example, I had a friend go through a divorce recently where his wife cheated on him, was in a new relationship, was getting financial support from this new person. However, we are in a no-fault state, which means that even though the wife cheated and is in a new relationship, he's still paying alimony. And she's getting around the fact that she gets financial support from her new partner because she's not married to him. So let's talk about a prenuptial agreement first. A prenuptial agreement is a contract you can set up ahead of time before the marriage, outlining what happens when there's a divorce. And a prenuptial agreement talks about every type of asset and what your wishes and values are. So it can cover things like real estate, inheritance, business interests, personal property, and other types of assets. So let's start with some common prenuptial agreement mistakes. First mistake I tend to see is people not making sure that attorneys are involved. And this is very important, especially if you have a lot of assets or high net worth. If you set it up in advance and you have an attorney, and especially if you are higher net worth and the person you're marrying signs it and has no attorney, the courts are going to look at that more suspiciously than if the person is advised by an attorney. Mistake number 2 is hiding or undervaluing assets. And this is where people get in a lot of trouble down the road and prenuptial agreements are seen as invalid. So you want to make sure you're giving a clear disclosure and you're not hiding any assets. Step 3, using generic templates you find online or with AI. And every state has very specific laws around these types of agreements, how they need to be formed, how they need to be signed, what is valid in that state. So you want to work with a qualified licensed attorney in your state to get this set up the right way. Finally, you want to understand your state's specific laws. Like I mentioned before, some states have no-fault states, meaning that if you are at fault, you cheat, then the court doesn't even look at it. And there are states that look at everything as community property or equitably or separate property. So you really want to be aware what your state laws include and don't include and how they divide things if you were to separate. The reason this is so important is a lot of times you can inadvertently commingle assets and give up your rights as separate property. So for example, if you inherit $100,000 from your parents and you keep it in a separate account, in many states that will be separate. But if you put it in a joint bank account, even though you and your spouse maybe agree that it's separate, but then you later go through a divorce, you could end up losing that. So how can you protect assets once you're married? Well, that's where a post-marital agreement, also known as a postnup, comes in. And this is a legal contract that you enter into after you are already married. And it's important here, again, that both of you have attorneys and are going through things. It's a good idea to consider a post-marital agreement if you are in a blended family. You're both bringing children into the marriage because you don't want to create a Cinderella type experience where one of you dies and the assets all go to the spouse and your kids get disinherited. You can also set up a postnuptial agreement if you get an inheritance or you're opening a business or if there's any other reason, for example, death or divorce, that you want to set it up. So how does this work with estate planning? Well, estate planning comes into play because you're setting up what happens when you become incapacitated or when you pass away. And a postnuptial agreement and estate plan work hand in hand, especially for blended families. Here's what I mean by that. In most states, if you've been married for a certain amount of time, by default, according to public policy, your spouse must inherit your assets after you pass away. However, if you are in a blended situation and you have children from a prior marriage, or maybe you have an elderly parent you want to take care of, you can together put that in an estate plan. However, your spouse also has to waive their spousal rights in a separate post-marital agreement. So you're going to want to make sure you work with both an estate planning attorney and an attorney that specializes in post-marital agreements. Otherwise, that estate plan could be seen as void. So what happens if you're already married and your spouse won't sign a marital agreement and you're receiving an inheritance or things aren't going well and you want to make sure you're protected? Well, you don't want to start hiding assets because that can really backfire in a divorce. The best thing you can do is go and meet with a qualified family law attorney in your state and go through strategy based on your specific state's laws. I've heard many horror stories and bad stories of people moving assets or hiding assets thinking that they're going to do the right thing, and the courts really hammer them. So you want to be advised, even if you are in the right, you want to make sure that you are handling things in a way that a lawyer and a judge is going to agree with. If you like this video, you're probably the type of person that likes to keep things smooth and organized for your loved ones, especially for when you pass away. That's why I recommend you head over to deadkit.com and download my Sorry I'm Dead, Now What kit. It sounds morbid, but I promise it's the best way to get things financially organized and make sure that your loved ones are left with everything organized instead of chaos and a mess. I'll see you in the next video.